Okay, so now let's look at some real life middleware and how we might use it. Now, originally, let's say we wanted to, as I mentioned in the last part, deny access to a certain page if the user isn't signed in. Now, we're not really talking about an authentication system here, so I'm just going to really roughly implement this, but the idea remains the same. Now, if, for example, we had a topics show page, so we were able to show a particular topic, let's say that we wanted to deny access to this particular route for a user, but we wanted to allow this for everyone. So anyone can access this one. You have to be signed in to access this one. So let's create a new show method on our topic controller, and let's take a look at how we might do this. So we know that in this case, we're getting through an ID. So we're not going to pull this together in a real life app, but you know how to access your database now and all that kind of stuff. You know how to return a view. So all that stuff should be pretty simple. So in this case, let's just return args and then ID just so we can see this page. And let's come over to this in the browser and then we'll work on protecting against this. So this is our topic index. I've removed that middleware we looked at in the last part. And this is topic 1, topic 2, so on and so forth. So we want anyone to be able to access this, but we have to be signed in to access a topic page. And just as a kind of side note, if you think about it, you could also protect users against having to be not signed in to access something. For example, a register page. If someone is signed in, you don't want them to re-register or re-log in. So you could use this middleware in the same way as well. We'll maybe look at an example of that in a minute. So now that we have this set up, what we're going to be doing in this part is just defining out our middleware as closure-based middleware, and then in the next part we're going to look at class-based middleware. So I'm going to do all of our middleware just inside of here. Really, if you were to be defining this out as closure-based middleware, probably the best thing to do would be to create a separate middleware file and require that in just to keep things tidy. But we'll do it in here for now just to keep things simple. So let's say that we have some middleware saying authenticated. So we have authenticated middleware, which requires that a user must be signed in, and we can add it to any of our routes. So to test this out, let's go ahead and just create some really simple middleware to handle this, and then we'll kind of update it for a real life scenario. So we know that we get our request through, we know that we get our response through, and we know that we get the next callable middleware. So in here, what we typically would want to do, and when you're building middleware, you would always want to, usually at the bottom, just return the next request, passing through the current state of the request and passing the current state of the response. Now it's really important we do this because the next layer in the middleware needs to know the current state of the request and the response. So super important. So again, just to kind of test this out, let's go ahead and grab our response actually, and let's say get body, and let's go ahead and write something to this just so we know that this is working, and let's attach it to this route just here that we know that a user must be authenticated to access. Okay, so over to the browser, if we give that a refresh, we know that that middleware has now been applied. And of course, over on here, it hasn't been applied because we've only added it to this particular route. So now what we want to do is, and just imagine you had some kind of login page. So if we go /login, and I'm just going to define out a closure-based route for this, and I'm just going to return the text login. Let's just pop over to this just so we can see that that's working as well. So come over to here, over to login, and there's our login page. So if we're not signed in, we want to, from here, redirect to the login page. Now we already know how to redirect. We've already looked at redirecting, and we know that that happens within our response. We can add headers to our response, or we can use methods like with redirect. So really what we need to do in here is an if statement to check if a user isn't signed in. So in this case, let's just go ahead and say if true, just to kind of imagine that they this check has always said that they're not signed in. Then we want to modify our response with a redirect. So we reassign to response and we say response. And remember earlier, we looked at our redirecting, and we can check this over in vendor slim and over in our HTTP response object. We know that we have a with redirect method passing in the URL that we want to redirect to and any status as well. So in this case, we can just say with redirect, and then we can choose the page that we want to redirect to. Now, in terms of our closure-based controllers, what we can do is go ahead and use our container within here if we wanted to. So we could very easily just say use container like so, and then we could use our router to build up a URL. Now, we already know how to do this, and if you are struggling with things like this, just remember that over in our Bootstrap app file, we have a container router, which we pass to our Twig extension, which allows us to build up them helpful URLs. And we know that within the Twig extension here, this will actually use this to build up a path. So this router path for, and then a name of a route. So in this case, we can kind of just pull all this together as we normally would. In this case, all we would need to do is over in our middleware, using our container, say container, router, path for, and then maybe we had a name on our login page. So if we come over to our login page here and set a name on this and set this to login, then what's happening here is if we are not authenticated, in this case we don't have a sensible check, we go ahead and update the response with a redirect header, which is essentially happening here, and then we go ahead and call the next middleware, and this should work. So here's our login page. We'll get rid of this for now, but we'll land on this and see what happens. And you can see we're redirected to the login page. So obviously at the moment, we're just saying if true, but let's imagine that somewhere in your app you had sessions set. So if we would say session start, then over in our middleware, we would say something like if not is set $_session, maybe a user ID or something like that. But like I said, we're not implementing a full login system here. We are just checking. So now if we go over to topics and one again, we know that that session isn't set, so we're redirected. If we were to kind of just manually set this somewhere, so just say session and then user ID equals 1, and then go ahead and give the page a refresh, that session is now set. So what we can now do is come back over to topics and 1, and we know that we're let in because we have that session. Now it's up to you how you would implement your authentication system, but obviously this is just an example. So hopefully that makes sense. Very, very convenient way to do these kind of things. Remember, you can also modify your request as well. So for example, if you were to create some middleware that set some kind of token that you needed to use within your controllers, you can very easily do that. So just as a kind of another example, let's go ahead and define out some middleware to do this, just as a kind of example before we move on to class-based. So we know that we want our request, response, and our next request. Now in this case, we're not redirecting anywhere, we're just modifying our request. So all we would do is we would say something like request, and how would we set some kind of data that we needed to use? Well, again, because the source code for Slim is so simple, all we really need to do is come over to Slim, over to the HTTP section, head over to the request, and look for some kind of method that would allow us to do this. So in this case, we can't find anything for set, but if we would say maybe with, so with attribute name value, this will allow us to set some attributes into our request. So let's go ahead and roll with this. So maybe we'd say request equals request with attribute. Maybe we had some kind of token that we needed to set somewhere. And I'm kind of relating this to cross-site request forgery, which there is a package for Slim, which does of course use middleware. And let's say our token was ABC123, just as an example. Of course, not forgetting to return the next middleware with the current state of the request, which we've added an attribute to, and with our response. We could modify the response in here as well if we wanted to. And let's just say that for this, we also wanted to go ahead and add in that token middleware. So we had some kind of token in our request. Well, now what's going to happen is if we just keep this in here, come over to here, we get this, but the difference now is that the request we get through into this method, if we just kill the page here and then do a echo on request. In fact, let's do a var dump on request just to see what kind of data we have in here. Give that a refresh, and in this case it's a bit of a mess, so let's just go ahead and directly access this. We're going to say request get param token, and what we should get, and so in this case we would have to use get attribute, that makes sense, we get that token. So we've modified the request to have this in here and we can go ahead and extract it. And if you are interested in looking at the cross-site request forgery package, we have a course on that as well, so you can follow that. And that is literally just implementing middleware, which sets some tokens which you can use to validate if a cross-site request forgery attack is taking place. So that is pretty much our middleware done. A couple of practical examples, although the token is less practical because we haven't really looked at a real life implementation, but certainly this is enough to go ahead and use to maybe check if a user is signed in. You redirect them if they are not. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so now that we have looked at the useful nature of middleware, how it works, we've dived into the source code. Really, I would not recommend using closure-based middleware like this. There's nothing wrong with doing this. If you prefer doing this, feel free to split it out into a separate file and then maybe require this in at the bottom here just before your roots. But what we're going to do in the next part is look at class-based middleware, which is a lot tidier, allows us to create a class to keep things nice and tidy in our auto-loaded app folder.